Hello everyone, this is Jay here, and today we are going to be talking about the starter decks. So, especially this will be part one of three that I'm going to essentially in each part of these videos I will take you through my thoughts on the starter decks for each of the three different sets. So today we're going to be talking about Amber Amethyst. And stay tuned in for future videos about the other two starter decks. But in each of these videos, I'll talk about the cards that are existing in the starter deck itself, and then some tips and tricks to help you kind of think through your deck and how to kind of play your deck, as well as some matchups against the other starter decks. This is also especially useful if you're planning on playing starter decks at your local LGS or in the Gen Con upcoming starter deck demos or challenges. So hopefully these will be good quick summary videos to help you just be able to play a little bit better in Lorcana. And I will be assuming that you know kind of already the basic rules for Lorcana and stuff. And that you need a quest to 20 lore and all of that other good stuff. So without further ado, let's talk about the Amber Amethyst set list here. So as you can see, I arranged all of the cards by their quantity and ink costs. And some of the higher ink costs, that's 5, 6, or 7, I just have down at the very bottom here. So let's just talk about each cards individually and then this deck as a whole. As they say, in order to do well, first you have to know your own deck, and then you have to know your opponent's deck, right? So we're gonna try to do both of that in this video, and I'll try to do it provide a really brief summary to help you guys all get started. So we have quite a few one drops here. We have Olaf, the Friendly Soulman, Pascal, the essentially evasive one drop, Stitch, New Dog, Hey Hey, and then some actions and items. So 3 Dingle Hoppers and 2 Control Your Tempers. So in general, for the one drops in Amber Amethyst, we only have 2 copies of Pascal. And then 2 copies of Hey Hey. I would definitely say Pascal is the premium one drop in this starter deck. So you probably always want to play out the Pascals unless you really need it to ink, just because it provides lore over a time range, and it's pretty annoying for your opponents to deal with. So Pascals are definitely great in the Amber Amethyst deck. Second up, I would say Hey Hey. It's a pretty close tie between the Stitch and the Hey Hey, though I think Hey Hey provides a little bit more utility for its one drop because it can support your other characters by giving them more power and allowing you to make some more favorable trades. But even Hey Hey itself is a significant drop in terms of playability than Pascal, I would say. So realistically, in a starting opening hand, unless I'm going second and I want to make sure I have a one drop to play to answer opponents' cards, typically all of these other one drops are not. I wouldn't venture to say useless, but not very useful, except for Pascal. So that's the great thing to know about it. Finally, we have 3 copies of Dingle Hopper and 2 copies of Control Your Temper. These cards are pretty much just trash. You always want to be inking them, never playing them, unless for some reason there's a niche case. And if you're running into these cases, then you would have probably piloted your deck a lot and know all of the intricacies. But if you're just starting out, just the basic rule of thumb is just ink all of your Dingle Hoppers and Control Your Tempers whenever you get a chance to. By that same rule and logic, these would probably be the first cards that you want to take out of your deck if given the opportunity. Because the reasoning behind it is they just don't provide that much value. So normally in card games like this, we talk about like kind of um how much like value you get out of like a card. So for example, if you can play out a character and it can quest for a lot of lore, it has a lot of value. If you can play out a character and it can attack an opponent's character and still live, that has a lot of value there. So the issue with Control Your Temper is if you play it and reduce an opponent's strong character and allow for you to attack with your character into that opponent's strong character. Essentially, that's the equivalent of playing out a really strong character yourself and attacking it and trading it off, right? Because it's a 1-for-1 in terms of card value. Realistically, you're probably better off playing anything else because that the card that you play could probably also trade 1-for-1 into an opponent's character. But you really want to try to play those cards that allows you to trade 2-for-1s or even better. So therefore, thus I think these 5 action and item cards are just best of do your best to try to avoid them. Always mulligan them if you open them in your starting hand, and if you get them in as you play the game or in your first draw, they're an easy ink, right? So that's a great way to think about it. Now onto the 2-drops. We have here 3 magic rooms, 2 faciliers, 3 mini mouses, 2 Yzmas, and 2 Be Our Guests. I think of all of the valuable cards here, Be Our Guest is probably going to be some of the more valuable. It allows us to essentially replace itself with more options. And as a player, if you have more options, it always it gives you a little bit more of an edge. So I would say if you're thinking about inking Be Our Guest, think it's definitely you can do it if you really need to ink, but it would be a tough choice to have to ink any of the Be Our Guests, and we only have 2 copies of these. So about magic brooms. So in the Amber Amethyst deck, you have 3 magic brooms, but you only have 1 Mickey Mouse. Magic brooms are strictly worse than Minnie Mouse. Notice how it's a 2/2 that costs 2 and you gain 1 lore, versus a Minnie Mouse that's a 2/3 with the exact same stats. However, the additional benefit of Magic Broom is that it allows you to shuffle important cards in your discard pile into your deck. As well as if you have a Mickey Mouse on, it really boosts the value of the Magic Brooms. So the way I would think about it is, if you have a Mickey Mouse in your hand that you can play, the value of Magic Brooms goes through the roof. You always want to play Mickey Mouse and Magic Brooms. However, if you don't have your one of Mickey Mouse, these are a lot more inkable than the Minnie Mouses. So feel free to ink the Magic Brooms. If you don't have a better turn 2 option, you can play it. But these are also potential inks just in case you run into trouble if you have a handful of uninkable cards or something like that. Yzmas are great early game and horrible late game cards. So they are really weak and fragile, but in the beginning of the game, your opponents are trying to do their own things, so sometimes you can quest with these Yzmas and still have them survive. However, late game, they often never survive, so essentially it's a card that you can quest for 1, look at the top card of your deck, and then it dies. And it doesn't trade very well. So late game, definitely ink the Yzmas, but early game, if you get opportunities to, feel free to play them and try to get the value of at least looking at the top card of your deck. And if it's great, keep it. And if it's not good, just throwing it to the bottom of your deck. Finally, we have the Minnie Mouses. These are just the iconic 2-drop, 2/3. Really good for a turn 2 play, especially if you're trying to just establish a bit more board control. So Minnie Mouses are definitely the staple in your 2-drops here. In your three drops, you have two Mickey Mouse True Friends, three The Wardrobes, two Maximuses, two Maleficents, three Rafikis, three friends on the other side, and one part of your world. So typically, how I look at it is now we're actually dealing with the uninkable cards, right? So we have Rafikis and part of your worlds as uninkable. Typically, you don't really want to keep uninkables in your starting hand, and you want to just uh, draw them as you need them. However, I would say that at least for Rafiki, it is a very good three drop. So you might consider keeping one, no more than one, in your opening hand, just because it provides a very big tempo play and something where your opponent may not expect. However, with part of your world, in general, you always want to wait until late game to draw this card because early game you don't really have any good targets in your graveyard in order to play or sing this song. So those are the thoughts for the uninkables. The rest of these cards, Maleficents and Friends on the Other Side, really great. Almost always keep because they just replace themselves. They're card draw, right? And plus they give you a body on the board. Maximus is a great combat. So you play this and you have a 3/3 on board. And it allows you if you need to swing into an opponent, you can do it favorably with Maximus. So definitely good to keep that in mind. You always want to get the most use out of your characters. Mickey, so if you don't have a need to challenge opponent's board, then Mickey may be a better play because it provides two lore for the same 3/3 stats. And if you need more characters on your field, then the wardrobe would be the best play because it has the best stat line of your three drops. So these three are very anytime we're getting into the three drop or higher, these are all great cards to draw and play out if you can. And now we're getting into more of the situational when you want to play these cards. Cool. So now we're on to the four drops. So we have two copies of Ariel on human legs, two copies of Jetsam, one copy of Mickey Mouse, two copies of Jafar Wayward Sorcerer, two copies of Hakuna Matata, one copy of Hades, and two copies of Cinderella Gentle and Kind. Right off the bat, I should just mention two of these cards are definitely from my experience worse than the others. And that's Hakuna Matata and Cinderella. I always have a much easier time inking Hakuna Matatas and Cinderellas. So Hakuna Matatas are bad just because, like the other healing actions, you would almost always want a character or something else that's more impactful. Draw some more cards, play our character, that sort of stuff. Just healing doesn't really matter too much in the starter deck matchup against each other. So yes, bad cards here. For Cinderella, its ability is also really bad to be able to heal princesses. We're starting to get a theme here, right? Healing bad, everything else good in the Amber Amethyst. Anyways, so essentially you can read Cinderella Gentle and Kind as a 4-drop, 2/5, that quests for 2. Now, sometimes if you don't have any other 4 drops in hand, this works in a pinch. It quests for a lot and it has a pretty bulky stat line, so opponents can't really kill it super easily. But you would almost always play some of these other 4 drops if you can avoid playing a Cinderella here. Okay. Now we get onto Hades. I would group Hades into the same category as part of your world. Great when you draw into it late game, but also something where if you keep it in your hand, you always have an option to do, right? You always want to consider what your opponent might be killing or what you could be trading and then getting it back with Hades. Jafar is a great challenger. It doesn't provide a lot of presence on the board, but in some matchups that I'll talk about later, Jafar is amazing just to have on board. you don't necessarily need a quest with Jafar or anything, but having 5 damage is great here. Mickey, you almost always want to keep in your starting hand because the chances of drawing into a Broom are a lot higher than the chances of drawing into a Mickey. And if you can get Mickey and Broom value there, you are well on your way to victory. And jetsams are great because they are a way to enable evasive for your flotsam, but also just to quest or challenge, and your opponents have a really tough time dealing with evasives. And finally, Ariel on human legs is slightly better than the Cinderella with 3/4 that quests for 2. And also great if you have the opportunity just to play out 4-drop. You can notice the theme here in Amber Amethyst of none of your cards are really super strong. Like 3/4 is like I would say your average like top end stat line that you're gonna have multiple copies of. So you really need to trade well running this deck and really know how to kind of manage board control as well as lore pressure in order to kind of both pressure your opponents into not doing their optimal plays by being close to 20 lore, and as well as having board control, which is characters on your board, so that if opponents plays out threats or a lot of creatures that they're using to quest, you can kill them and still keep your own characters on. Finally, we have the higher cost cards. Let's talk about Moana first. The iconic card, I wouldn't say iconic. Mickey Mouse is also iconic, but the iconic card in Amber, the face card in Amber. Unfortunately, my thought is Moana is just a really bad card in this deck. Okay, I have inked Moana turn 1 and have been never like essentially regretted it. Now, that's not to say that there isn't a place for Moana. If you're doing well on board control and you can afford to bring out more pressure, yes, you can definitely play out the Moana. But on turn 5, it doesn't challenge well into opponents. It only quests for 3 lore, and opponents can generally kill it off. So this isn't really that much of a threat, and you should really treat Moana as a card that reads 5 ink to play, gain 3 lore the next turn, essentially. But having said that, if you have a lot of like presence on the board and your opponent isn't able to clear out Moana, feel free to run her out. I typically always mulligan her if I see her in my starting hand. Flotsam is a great card. Same thing, similar to Rafiki. It has natural rush, and plus it has 4 health, which means you can use it to challenge into opponent's 3 attack characters, and this thing will still survive. What's even better is if you can have Jetsam on the board, playing out Flotsam also gives it evasive, which means that now after it gets its initial rush opportunity, to challenge, it can start questing for 2 each turn, and opponents have a hard time dealing with it. So that's also a great card. I would say almost like way better than Moana in every possible way. For the 6th drop, you have Sven, which is a great it's your strongest character. It only quests for 1, but what you really want to do is place it there to like essentially kill off all of your opponent's heavy questers while allowing you to quest and get more lore there. So I would probably I would most likely mulligan 7 in my starting hand, but if I ever draw into it, I would never ever ink the 7. Just aim to on turn 6 play him out, and then finally I would say the win condition of this deck, even more so than the Mickey and the Brooms, is this Dr. Facilier. He just provides so much value that I would encourage anyone who's running this Amber Amethyst deck to always keep Dr. Facilier, even though he's undroppable, uninkable, even though he's 7 drop, always keep it in your starting hand. It adds value to your 2-drop Dr. Facilier's because you can get this 7-drop out even faster. And most of the time, what you end up wanting to do is not even quest unless you know for sure that it's safe to quest with Dr. Facilier or challenge with him. But you want to just keep him on board just so that you could use your other characters to challenge into your opponent's characters and bounce them right back to your hand, allowing you to replay them. And right now, in all of the starter decks, there's no good remove, not too many good removals. Your opponent needs to either play cannons and smash, grab your swords, or dragonfire in order to deal with Dr. Facilier's effect, which are all cards that they would probably also want to play on any of your other characters that you have on the field. So and plus you have two great ways to get this card back from your graveyard with Part of Your World and Hades. So I would say if you have an opportunity to play Dr. Facilier, don't forget about like all of the other basics like board control and quest lore or gaining lore. But if you have a chance, just play the Facilier. It is a great card. Okay, so that's kind of the overview of this deck and kind of how to look at it. In terms of gameplay, across like the board, I would say there's a couple of different strategies. One is if you know you have Facilier in your hand, you should try to start focus on like making sure your opponent isn't able to run away with questing, which means you want to probably like try to play out characters that can challenge your opponent or not make them want to quest with their characters. If you have Dr. Facilier, if you have Mickey and Brooms in your hand, you should probably focus on that as a way to kind of gain card advantage, get an advantage in your game. Other than that, what most games end up being is if you get Pascals in your hand or like Jetsams, go the evasive route. Try to gain lore while your characters can't be challenged and are evasive. And then sometimes you want to have some Olafs or Stitches in your hand just to deal with opponent as they try to rush out their characters. You don't want to be too late in like establishing like strong cards because sometimes early game presence can be the lore difference between winning and losing. So other than that, pretty much the name of this the game with this deck is just to figure out what your opponent has and try to play the things that are most optimal against it. You have a lot of cool tools like Rafiki, which if an opponent quests with their 2/2 character thinking, oh, they'll be completely safe because you don't have any 2/2 characters that would be a good trading to them. Turn 3, bam, slam down a Rafiki and you got a great trade. Same thing with Maximus. Slam it down, give an opponent like a minus attack and trade favorably. So you have some cool tricks there, as well as friends on the other side for card draw. So you always want to aim to draw more cards. They're always going to be an advantage for you. And pretty much, really, a lot of the game is just experience, practicing running this deck, and eventually trying to figure out, like, in an instant against this opponent and what they have on board, what would be the best play. And that changes so much. And this is what makes, I would say, this one of the I think this is the second most difficult deck to pilot among the starter decks here. Let's talk about some matchups. So, we're just gonna skip the mirror match because in a mirror match, it's just about like kind of who draws into the better cards, who knows how to pilot their deck and get some of their trades better, like make use of their Maximus tricks, Rafiki tricks, get their like Cinder or not Cinder Ariels, Jetsam Flotsams on board faster and so forth. But let's bring in the Emerald Ruby. And then let's bring in a Sapphire Steel deck. And I will just talk about some quick matchup tips against each of these decks. So if we take a look at the matchup against Ruby Emerald, um, let me okay, so they have a lot of evasive cards in their deck. So one of their main strategies is going to be try to win through their Peter Pans and their Pongos. Where is their Pongo? So Peter Pan is a 3-drop, and Pongo is a 4-drop. Pongo quests for 2 and is evasive. So the one thing you'll note here is your deck has no hard removal. The only way for you to deal with your opponent's characters is for you to challenge into them. So if your opponent has some like early game Peter Pan and Pongo plays, you really only have 2 options. One is if you can bring your own evasive characters in to challenge them and take them off the board, or 2 to beat them in terms of lore. It's really hard to race against evasive characters, but if you don't have an option, that's the best thing you can do. But other than that, some tips and tricks for challenging into them is you have don't forget that Pascal has evasive as long as you have another character on the board. So a combo like Hey Hey with Pascal can actually take out a Peter Pan. So just one trick to know. Ideally, if you can get a Jetsam out, Jetsams can take out a Peter or Flotsam. Jetsams will trade into the Peter Pan. Jetsams are great for taking out the Pongo because it survives an attack against the Pongo. Flotsams are great if you have a Jetsam to take out the Peter Pan and still survive. So these are like really the only tools you have in order to deal with it. Always remember that you have tools like Be Our Guest, Friends on the Other Side, to try to dig for your Jetsams, Flotsams, and Pascals. And if any of them are in your graveyard, don't forget that you can bring them back potentially with Hades or part of your world. So that's one kind of win condition from your opponent. The other thing to note there is the Ruby Emerald deck has a lot of ways to remove lore from your score. So, for example, they have Rapunzels, they have Aladdins, um, and I'm pretty sure they have some other cards there. So always try to be aware that however much lore you think you have, it's likely going to be a little bit less. They also have the small Aladdin here. Now one play that you might come up against is if they play out an Aladdin and seem to want to keep it alive. Very likely that's because they want to shift it into an Aladdin Heroic Outlaw. This is a card where if they, let's say you have a board on of a couple of different cards, and they have 4 ink, and they play out an Aladdin Street Rat. Next turn, what they have the option of doing is shifting onto the Aladdin and challenging one of your characters with a 5/5 and removing 2 of your lore and gaining 2 lore themselves. So while I don't necessarily recommend not questing with anything, just always be aware that that could be a play, and whatever you quest with, note that you have to be okay with that thing dying to Aladdin, essentially. Ideally, you can just quest with your evasive characters and Aladdin can't do anything. On the same note, if your opponent has an Aladdin on board already, a lot of times I see newer players, they quest even though they end up losing that lore to Aladdin when he challenges. One thing to know is it's fairly easy to play around an Aladdin on board. Opponents typically don't want to quest with their own Aladdin because if they exert it to quest, then now it's vulnerable. You can kill it. But if they don't quest with it, you're essentially just adding lore onto your board. And ideally, if you're pretty close to 20, you can not quest and add enough lore so that you end up getting to 20. and then quest all at once, not giving Aladdin the option of challenging and making you lose lore. Finally, against Ruby Emerald, you also have to be aware they do have this Dragonfire card. So that what that means is sometimes if you have a character on board like Ariel on Human Legs, if you don't quest with her, and your opponent plays a Dragonfire, you actually lose out on the two lores that you could have gotten. So sometimes it might be relevant, other times you actually might be fine with them running a Dragonfire. But just something to note, if you're pretty close to winning, let's say you have like 17 lore on the board, and you have an Ariel on Human Legs, and you have like one Stitch or something in your hand. If you play out the Stitch without questing with your Ariel, there is a possibility that your opponent can Dragonfire your Ariel, leaving you still with 17 where you could have been at 19 lore. Now, opponent could also like potentially like play out Aladdin or have out an Aladdin, so you might not want to quest for other reasons, but in a vacuum, just be aware of this interaction. Finally, we have the other card that I wanted to mention in the Ruby Emerald matchup is where is it? It's the card that lets the opponent draw a card, Mad Hatter. This is another great card that you'll probably see a lot in the matchup against Ruby Emerald. The Mad Hatter is just a great threat. 3 lore. Whenever you challenge into it, your opponent can draw a card. So if you challenge into it with 3 characters, opponent can draw 3 cards. So you really, it's a really tough card to deal with. Probably, I would say among one of the better cards in the Ruby Emerald against an Amethyst still, because you don't have removal. If we take a look at that card, it's a 2/4 that quests for 3 lore. The good news, the saving grace, is it costs 5 to play, which means that if you look at your own 5 cost cards, you really only have Sven and Jafar. So the best play would be playing out a Jafar or a Sven to deal with your opponent's Mad Hatter, because that way it just trades kills it off with like in one turn. Otherwise, you're gonna have to run multiple characters into it, and it'll give your opponents multiple draws. Now, if you have Hey Hey on board, your 3 costs now can just trade into the Mad Hatter. And so that also is a little bit of an advantage there. So just be aware, you really want Jafar and Sven getting close to turn 5 or turn 6 against that Mad Hatter. But in a pinch, like if you have to trade 2 of your characters into it, it does only have 2 attacks, so it likely won't be able to kill off any of your characters. And hey, sometimes you just gotta do it whatever you can to prevent your opponent from questing for 3 lore, right? Cool. So that is the Ruby Emerald matchup. Let's put these cards back. Okay. Now let's take a look at the bane of the starter deck's existence, what I consider the Steel Sapphire decks. This is just a really good deck that's easy to pilot, that you're probably gonna run into, and you'll realize that they have some scary, tough creatures. They have a lot of everything, right? They can ramp into a lot of ink faster than you can. They also have early game challengers to prevent you from really questing well, and so forth. So just really quickly, a lot of times you'll see opponents play out Prince Eric's or Captain Hook's on turn 1 or 2, as well as the Grandma Tala for ramp. So these are some of the most iconic early game plays. Sometimes you might see a Goons or 2 there, but I would say and plus a turn 3 Mickey. So one thing to note in common is these cards are not very threatening on its own. game. So they only quest for one lore. They have pretty weak stats unless it's in a challenge, and they really don't do much of anything else. Now, what that really leads is that you're not super threatened by Captain Herc or Prince Eric because opponents are probably not going to want to quest with them. Or if they do, you'll probably get a favorable trade there. So that just means that early game, you can really try to set it up so you get great trades against all four of these cards. So in other words, have cards that have like Dr. Facilier that you can quest with, because both Captain Herc and Prince Eric can't kill it. Unless, of course, they have both of them on the board. And if they attack into it, they exert themselves. So now you can kill the Herc with some other character. So Facilier is a great character just to set up against these challenge cards. It's always great to save some Rafikis in order to, the moment you get a Prince Eric or Captain Herc exerted, kill it off. Only take 1 damage. Great opportunity. What other cards? Maximus really doesn't help against these two cards, so they only have 1 attack in and of itself. So very likely you could be better off inking Maximuses and playing Rafikis or Mickey Mouses in this matchup. And against Grandma Tala or Mickey Mouse, feel free to play out like your minis, your Mickeys. So all that to say is, don't feel the need to early game quest, especially if opponents can have a Captain Herc or Prince Eric to take out your quester. You can afford to be a bit patient on turn 1 or 2. Now, having said that, it is a bit scary because the Steel Sapphire deck ramps very quickly. But on a side note, because they're ramping and they're inking a lot of times, they're also going to be running out of cards in their hands a lot. And so a lot of times you just have to wait patiently until they end up being in what we call top deck mode, and then dealing with their threats while still continuing to make principled plays and favorable trades. And it can be really tough being patient against the Steel Sapphire deck, but sometimes you just have to. And even sometimes being patient, they still get out their monster cards like Mufasa or Simba, and you can't handle all of the lore generation. That's part of the game. No one deck is gonna be able to win all the time, right, against another deck. The other thing to just watch out for is what do they have? So they have Mufasas, 2 copies of Mufasas, which is pretty insane. It's 6-drop 4/6, so you don't have really great ways to take care of them, right? And it quests for 3. They also have Simba's 5-drop Simba Rightful Heirs, that if it challenges into one of your characters, they gain a lore. Rather than if they quest, they would gain 2. Once again, that 3/5, we're starting to see a theme here, right, as well, where they have a lot of high toughness creatures that your cards aren't going to be able to trade favorably into. You're going to have to run 2 cards into some of these top end cards. And I think in general, the idea here is that's okay. Okay, if opponent plays out a Simba, ideally what you want is to have the board presence to be able to deal with it, because as a Amber Amethyst deck, you have a lot more card draw than they do, and so you can hopefully just draw more cards. And if it's a 2-for-1, that needs to go into one of like Steel Sapphire's big threats, so be it. It doesn't feel great, but sometimes you just have to do it and know that like if they're in top deck mode, they won't always draw into those big bombs. One thing to just also be aware of is they do have this nasty card called Grab Your Swords. So if you don't plan out your board correctly, and let's say if you have a lot of cards on your field that has 2 or fewer health, one grab your sword can wipe out your entire board. Essentially, it deals 2 damage to everything on your side of the field. And so, one thing to know is try to see if your opponent is telegraphing that they have this card. And by telegraphing, what that means is, are they making suboptimal challenges or plays that want you to have characters at 2 or less health, rather than outright killing off your characters? And if you start to think that is the case, just know that opponent might likely have a grab your sword in your hand and potentially start to be able to play around it a little bit. Finally, I would say I wouldn't worry too much about these fire the cannons. They're gonna have it. It's a 1-for-1 if they use it to take out like a Pascal or something like that. You can't really plan around it too much, so don't worry. And don't worry too much about the fire the cannons. You don't have to worry about their beast if you never play out your dingo hopper. So there, another reason why dingo hoppers are bad. And then finally they have the Maui, which is their kind of equivalent of our Jafar. It's the big boy that is an 8/8. Yeah, quests for 3. You're probably gonna have to spend like most of your board to take care of it. The saving grace is just know that if your opponent plays it and quests with it, if you can take it out, they only have 1 of, you'll never see it again. They don't have any recursion. Good riddance. So yeah, it's a threat you have to deal with. So having said that, everything I said about the Amber Amethyst playstyle, like the evasive package, the Mickey Mouse broom combo, still all apply. Like principled moves, being patient against Sapphire Steel, trying not to make bad trades and mistakes are gonna lead you a long way towards victory here. It's a tough matchup, but then you always have the saving grace of if you can somehow manage to draw Dr. Facilier. So more so in the Ruby Emerald deck. Against Steel Sapphire, I would probably mulligan a little bit more aggressively to try to get the Dr. Facilier into your hand. If you can manage to do so, and can play it out, and then it just provides so much more value. Now, let's say your opponent plays out like their Mufasas or big creatures. Using 2 characters to challenge into your opponent, and having them return right back to your hand so you can play them right back out, just helps you win this matchup. So one other thing to consider with how good Dr. Facilier is. Really like good against all sorts of matchups there. Cool. So those are my thoughts against the with this Amber Amethyst starter deck. And I will continue to. I hope this helps anyone who's thinking about utilizing Amber Amethyst. It's a pretty fun deck. It really teaches you a lot of the basics and how to get good at Lorcana. I think it's a deck that really tries to like it really forces you to learn some of the more nuances of the mechanics of the game, how to make good challenges, when to quest, when to race your opponent versus when to do board control. So all of that sort of stuff is required to win with this deck. So I hope this helps you. And if you run Amber Amethyst, just keep some of these things in mind, and I'm sure it'll go a long way to helping you defeat your opponents there. Anyways, that's it from me today. Stay tuned in to check out my future deck explanations with the other starter decks, Ruby Emerald and Steel and Sapphire. And hopefully you'll be able to take something out of all of those videos as well. Take care and have a great day.